Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about a topic which I would say generated quite some discussion a couple of years ago. Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. And with the first DAO, of course, things didn't go as expected. We all know what happened. We all know it was a bit of a disaster, but it doesn't mean that just because the first popular DAO was a disaster, that the whole concept is a failure. On the contrary, I think that DAOs will have quite an important part to play in the general ecosystem in the near future. But just to start off, let's take a look at traditional organizations, centralized organizations. Well, we all know how they look like. We have the CEO on top. Then we have the next person who should have been the CEO or thinks he should have been CEO and didn't quite make the cut. President. Moving on, we have all the others who are candidates for presidents or CEOs. And then we have the employees. It's a typical structure, top-down, lots of different levels, and lots of bureaucracies and inefficiencies. Moreover, there's also limited commitment by those who feel that they shouldn't be punching over their pay grade, so to speak. They feel that they should stay where they are since they're not being paid enough to do anything else. This also leads to poor creativity and limited motivation. Moreover, there's also resistance to change by those who are controlling the entity, simply because they want to retain control. So, what if we were to move towards decentralization through, of course, our favorite technology, blockchain? Well, this does have various benefits. First of all, you have a record of each and every action, each and every command taking place in the organization. This can be done through the use of a shared ledger. Then, you will also have consensus on each and every action taking place in the organization itself. Of course, you also have one of the greatest benefits of blockchain technology, which is immutability. You cannot commit a decision or an action and then say, well, I wasn't the one who did it. Because it would be there for the whole world to see, or rather, at least, for the whole organization to see. Moreover, you have no centralized points of access or control. It's all being done in a decentralized manner. So this leads us to DAOs. So what are some of the benefits of DAOs? Basically, you have a business which is run through code, through smart contracts. And all the rules are hard-coded from the outset in the smart contract itself. Changes can be done. You might want to shift to a different smart contract at the future. But basically, right from the get-go, you know what you're going to get. You can have all the financial records of the organization being stored on the blockchain, along, of course, with all the rules. However, DAOs do have certain, let's say, issues, certain questions, which, up until now, have not been fully resolved. There's also the fact that, again, you have no central authority in the DAOs making certain decisions. It's all decentralized. But then again, if we're talking about decentralization, what happens if something were to go wrong? Who would be liable? Of course, again, just to reiterate, decisions are taken in a peer-to-peer manner. There is no one who would be, let's say, superior to anyone else making such decisions. And we have various examples of DAOs which are already existing and operating even now. We have Wings, Dash, DigixDAO, and the last one, no need to mention who they are, but of course they were the pioneers in this particular space. DAOs allow for 4 different themes to be converged. First of all, you have organizational decentralization. Secondly, you have the unbundling of rules and deregulation as a result. Keep in mind that it doesn't mean that DAOs are going to be created to exist outside the ambit of general regulation. but it just means that the rules which, let's say, make up the DAO will be unbundled and clearer for everyone to see and interpret. You have crypto trust, and that leads to, again, a uniform way of achieving consensus. And it also leads to peer production. Everyone has something to give towards the DAO. Why, again, go for a DAO? I'm going to reiterate some of the benefits of a DAO. Again, as I just mentioned, a DAO is created for one main purpose, and that is to produce value. All the other byproducts of centralized organizations are not present in a DAO. So rather than losing time and efforts trying to reach your manager, your CEO, doing meetings, which most of the time are less than productive, let's face it, all the decisions would be taken at a peer-to-peer level and transparent for everyone to see. Basically, that would mean that you would have usage with direct value output, rather than the current situation where we have usage without actual value, and a lot of wasted resources and time for all the components of the organization, centralized organizations. Again, the value of the output of the DAO would be symbolized by the value of the cryptocurrency that is underlying it. So far, we're dealing with DAOs that utilize cryptocurrency in order to give value to what they are doing, to represent its particular value. There needs to be specific linkage between the user actions and the resulting efforts of the organization, as I just mentioned. And again, a DAO is testament to this in the sense that every action of the DAO would have an impact on the resulting value. In turn, of course, since all decisions taken by DAO are so precious, this would spur entrepreneurial creativity and, of course, instill further motivation for all the participants in the DAO. I'm just going to briefly discuss what Malta is doing in this particular space, which impacts, of course, DAOs and other decentralized structures. As you might have heard, this year, Malta launched the so-called DLT regulatory framework. And two of the acts which have been enacted by the Maltese Parliament are the Malta Digital Innovation Authority Act and the Innovative Technology Arrangements and Services Act. Starting off with the first one. The MDIA was created in July of this year, and essentially it's an authority which is a certifying body for the so-called technology arrangements. Technology arrangements are any DLT-based platform, application, smart contract, protocol, you name it, which would be certified by the Malta Digital Innovation Authority following an audit by licensed third-party systems auditors. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that if there's an open permissionless protocol being submitted for auditing, then basically all of the protocol would need to be audited, both at that present stage and also in the future. We, of course, recognize the fact that open permissionless decentralized structures, more often than not, cannot be regulated or even, let's say, standardized as such. But what we can do is introduce an element of standardization for certain centralized elements. The MDIA has also been created to liaise with all the regulatory authorities in Malta in relation to DLT. And as I mentioned, it works through approved third-party systems auditors. The ITAS Act, in turn, lays out technical requirements for the whole auditing process. And it also provides for the appointment of responsible persons for technology arrangements, so that if any change or any check needs to be done on technology arrangement, then the MDIA can reach out to a specific person who does not necessarily need to be the person responsible for the whole technology arrangement, but is simply the contact person in this particular case. We're talking about voluntary applications, so rest assured that anyone wishing to build the protocol out of Malta can choose to apply for certification on a completely voluntary basis. We don't want to force persons to apply for this certification. Now, how would the process of registration of DAOs work with the MDIA? The MDIA will keep a register of the DAOs as well as the technological platform being utilized. So mostly the auditing process will be pertinent to the platform, to the technology being utilized, smart contracts, and so on and so forth. we are also thinking about the possibility of classification of a new entity altogether when it comes to DAOs. And I'll be going into this quite shortly. But basically, we have been faced with two questions when thinking about DAOs. First of all, we're talking about decentralized liability. Who will be responsible if anything were to go wrong with the DAO? Can the DAO do something wrong and be sued? Secondly, if it is sued, who will represent it? What will happen in case there's a court case against the DAO? Is it even possible? This is why Malta is currently working on something called innovative technology foundations. Essentially, we're talking about foundations that, unlike traditional foundation setups, are made up of separate, segregated cells. Basically, the aim of ITFs will be to grant legal personality to technology arrangements, including DAOs. Essentially, segregated cells can be, let's say, administrative cells, liability cells, protocol cells, fund cells, and so on and so forth. The main point is that they will all be different segregated cells. This will also allow for decentralized control because the administrative cell can be made up of different persons who will in essence be decision makers in the DAO. Each and every cell, apart from being distinct, will also have its own separate patrimony. Why are we talking about ITFs? Why do we want to give legal personality to something like DAOs? First of all, we know that there will be a case in the future where someone might go after a technology arrangement or a DAO. So therefore, in this particular case, we want to ensure that if that happens, then the liability cell is fully segregated and separate from other controlling cells. The protocol, in particular, needs to be fully segregated. The technology at no point in time should be the subject of any legal proceedings. We're talking about technology that is there to be developed, that is there to serve humankind. We do not want the protocol to be part of any proceedings. It would also make mergers a lot smoother. I think that in the very near future, we'll see certain protocols merging with each other. Right now, if they're structured using companies, the merger can be a bit problematic. With this, basically, it's just a matter of taking the technology cell, the protocol cell from one foundation and putting it into another. This would also mean that legal responsibility is shifted away from the creators of a protocol. Why? Because you should go after the liability cell, or at most, the administrative cell, and never, ever after the creators of that particular protocol. Again, the core technology can also be migrated into an ITF, not just in the case of mergers, but even in the case of any ITFs which might run into problems. That's it from my end, and I'm ready to take on any questions you might have. Thank you.
It's really interesting and thoughtful framework. Thanks for sharing it. So I had one question, whether this is covered by the framework or not, but having worked in financial supervision of clearinghouses, in this case, type market infrastructure. So when our kind of supervision or examination team would go in, they would detect things. Maybe they need to update their cybersecurity policy. Maybe they need to handle assets differently, or they need to make some sort of change. So if the Maltese regulator is, if the DAO is this registered legal entity with the Maltese entity, and then the regulator or supervisor says, oh wait, we've detected something in your practices that could be cyber, could be customer related, would that just be put to a vote of the DAO stakeholders, or would they, how would something like that work, or is that kind of a detail for later?
As I mentioned, first of all, it's a good question, thanks. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, a technology arrangement should have some form of contact person. That contact person, does not always carry full responsibility for the underlying technology arrangement. Reason being that, in fact, the Act itself lists that in the case of fully open, permissionless, decentralized systems, it might not always be the case that, again, full compliance with the regulation can be achieved, because we're talking about something completely decentralized. In that particular case, what would happen is that the authority would reach out to that contact person, make them aware of the shortcomings, and then again, leave the particular entity to address the shortcomings. I would say that the worst case scenario, if compliance is not achieved, would be for basically the certification to be withdrawn. So that is, I would say, the mechanism being used in order to ensure compliance with the regulation. It might not always be possible for, let's say, fines or other punitive measures to be taken against this particular organization, especially if it's fully decentralized.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thanks very much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
That was great.